As usual, if you like these stories or it felt meaningful to you, feel free to like, share, and comment your thoughts below, as well as subscribe to our channel. It could be a huge support for our work. Now, let's just enjoy the stories.
That morning began exactly like every other morning in the Gold Coast mansion in Chicago. The marble floor caught the first light of dawn and threw it back in a pale sheen. The high-end espresso machine hummed with its steady, expensive patience. Two men in black stood outside the gate from 5 o'clock in the morning, silent as a wall, and everything ran smoothly, precisely, coldly, like a machine that had been running too long, for so long that no one remembered to ask what it was running for. Rafe Moretti, 37 years old, the boss who controlled most of Chicago's underworld, sat alone at the head of the 12-seat dining table. In front of him wasn't the Wall Street Journal. It was encrypted messages from 3 territories, last night's reports, confirmation that 1 shipment had cleared the port, 17 missed calls, the kind of calls where not picking up could mean a great many things. Breakfast cooled by degrees. A handgun rested in the kitchen drawer, the same drawer as the linen napkins. This was the man the entire underground city feared. Every order he gave never needed to be repeated a second time. He almost didn't look up. He almost dismissed that sound, the tiny scrape of small feet, a soft, uneven shuffle across marble. Too small, too off rhythm, too fragile for a house like this. In less than half a second, he nearly filed it away and brushed it aside with every other sound. But something made him lift his eyes. It wasn't survival instinct, the thing that had kept him alive for 13 years in the underworld. It was something older, something softer, something he'd believed had died along with his parents. A 3-year-old girl, big, round, brown eyes, a mess of black curls. She held a stuffed rabbit tight to her chest, one eye missing, as if she'd wandered out of the place she belonged and didn't quite know how to find her way back. And she was wearing shoes, pink shoes, or what had once been pink in some earlier life. Now they were bleached and dull, stained with watermarks. The left sole had separated from the body of the shoe, gaping like a small mouth with every step. The right shoe had no lace. The left toe had a hole worn straight through, and through that hole you could see the tip of a thin pink sock, so thin you could almost make out the tiny toes beneath it. 3 years old, wearing shoes that should have been thrown away 6 months ago, standing inside a $30 million house belonging to Chicago's Mafia boss, looking at him with those enormous eyes, without a single trace of fear. "Hi," she said. "This is Mr. Patch. He lost one eye, but he can still see where he's going." And Rafe Moretti, the man no one dared meet head-on, couldn't say a thing for 3 full seconds. The little girl turned away. She shuffled back toward the hallway. The torn sole scuffed the marble, so small, the smallest sound in the entire house, and yet it would follow him all day, all his life. Because there's something about men who spend 13 years building walls out of power, out of blood, out of a cold, practiced silence. When something finally makes it through, it doesn't leave behind a small hole. It brings the whole thing down. And what broke through Rafe Moretti's wall wasn't a bullet. It wasn't an enemy. It wasn't betrayal. It was the torn shoes of a 3-year-old child, and that simple line about a stuffed rabbit with one missing eye who could still see the road ahead. If this story touched some corner of you, tap like so more people can hear it. Share it with someone you think needs a beautiful story today. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Because sometimes the thing we need most arrives from the last place we would ever expect. Darcy Campos had learned, through years of necessary practice, how to make herself smaller inside large spaces. No one ever sat her down and taught her. It grew on its own, the way moss grows on the side that never gets sun. When you're a young woman on a modest income, moving through rooms built for a different kind of person, rooms with ceilings so high they made their own weather, rooms with paintings on the walls that cost more than everything her father earned in his whole life as a carpenter in Pilsen, rooms with a silence so deep and so expensive that even the air seemed to know it had a price. You learn to keep your footsteps light. You learn to speak only when you're spoken to offer brief, pleasant eye contact, and then turn right back to the work in front of you. You learn that the best version of yourself in places like this is the most invisible version. And Darcy Campos was already very good at that. She'd been working in the Gold Coast mansion for 11 months, 5 days a week, 8 hours a shift, head down, hands never stopping, and the quality of her work, the house manager Preston had written in her most recent evaluation, in a single word, was excellent. 11 months. And in those 11 months, Rafe Moretti had spoken to her exactly 4 times. The first was her start day, a short greeting as the boss passed through the hallway, without taking his eyes off his phone. The second was when she accidentally stood in the way of the office entrance, and he said, "Excuse me," in a voice that wasn't quite an apology, more an announcement that she was in the wrong place. The third was one evening when she stayed late cleaning, and he asked, without looking at her, whether Preston was here. The fourth was a nod as he passed her on the stairs, and a sentence she wasn't sure was meant for her or for the call in his earpiece, 4 times. All brief. All purely transactional. The kind of exchange between a person and the infrastructure around them. No different than the way you say thank you to a vending machine if you're the sort of person who talks to objects. Darcy didn't resent him for it. She understood, with the practical kind of understanding she applied to most things, that the very rich often lived in a different dimension, where the machinery that kept them comfortable was run by invisible hands, and the hands themselves weren't something you needed to think about very often. She was one of those hands, a hand that got paid. The pay kept her mother supplied with medicine. It kept the rent on time. It kept Bria fed. That was enough. But Darcy wasn't only good at being invisible. She was also good at watching. And in 11 months in this house, she'd seen enough to know that Rafe Moretti wasn't an ordinary businessman. 2 men in black stood outside the gate from 5 o'clock in the morning, switching shifts at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, never entering the house unless summoned, and never smiling. Preston took phone calls in the hallway in a voice 1 notch lower than his usual voice, using phrases Darcy understood well enough from growing up in Pilsen to know what they meant. Words about cleaning up, about leaving nothing behind. The meeting room in the basement she was never asked to clean, the door always shut, and sometimes when she passed by, the silence behind that door felt heavier than any noise she'd ever heard. She gathered all those fragments and set them into a drawer in her mind that she didn't open. Not because she was naive, not because she didn't know fear, but because fear was a luxury when you had a 3-year-old child depending on every dollar you brought home, when your mother needed medication every month, when the math of your life had no room for the variable called find a new job. So Darcy Campos kept her footsteps light, kept her eyes down, kept the fragments in a tightly closed drawer, and continued doing her work with excellent quality. And if, sometimes, on late evenings when she was cleaning the living room, and she heard the heavy footsteps of Rafe Moretti coming up from the basement, the footsteps of a man who'd just made decisions she chose not to think about, she only lowered her head a little more, moved a little more softly, and reminded herself she was here for Bria, for Louisa, for the numbers that had to balance every month. She was here because there was no better choice. And in Darcy Campos's world, better wasn't an abstract concept. It was a calculation, and the calculation said, stay. That calculation wasn't always Darcy's alone. In the first 14 months after Bria was born, she had her mother. Louisa Campos was the kind of woman who could stretch $1 until it cried for mercy, the kind of woman who could look into an almost empty refrigerator that anyone else would call nothing left, and somehow turn it into 3 days of meals for 2 adults and a baby, the kind of woman who had looked at her daughter at 24, single, no child support from the baby's father, working 2 jobs at the same time, and with the calm, clear eyes of someone who'd survived harder things, said simply, "We'll do the math." And they did, together, in the small 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen that smelled like cinnamon and Louisa's lavender hand cream, where Bria slept in a crib pushed close to Darcy's bed, and the train running past at midnight made the window frames tremble just a little. They did the math. Louisa watched Bria during the day so Darcy could go to work. Darcy worked double shifts so Louisa wouldn't have to worry about the rent. They passed the baby back and forth like they were passing a flame. Careful, precise, not letting it go out. Then Louisa got sick. The diagnosis arrived on a Tuesday in November, the kind of day the sky hangs gray and low, as if the universe designed it on purpose to be the backdrop for devastating news. Stage 3 cancer. The doctor said words Darcy heard, but for the first 20 seconds her mind refused to process them, as if language had briefly lost its connection to meaning. An aggressive treatment plan. Medical costs that were exactly the way medical costs in America are always exactly that way. Brutal to the point of abstraction. Numbers printed on paper so large they temporarily stopped meaning anything at all, until you sat with them long enough, alone, in the dark, and the meaning came back. worse than before. Louisa told Darcy not to worry. Darcy nodded and said she wouldn't. Then she went home, stepped into the bathroom, turned the water on as loud as it would go so Bria wouldn't hear, and she cried until there were no tears left, only the dry shaking of someone who was emptied out and still wasn't allowed to stop. 18 months ago. Louisa was better now, in remission, carefully, one test at a time, one held breath waiting for results, one slow exhale when the numbers on the page said, no recurrence. But the debt didn't go into remission. The debt was the permanent weather of Darcy's life. It was the air pressure she woke up inside every morning. It was the thing that decided every choice she made, from the grocery store to the gas station to the moment 8 months ago when she stood in a discount shoe store, looked at a pair of pink shoes in Bria's size, flipped the tag, saw $4.99, and put them in the cart. Because that week, $4.99 was the number that let the calculation stay alive. $4.99 was the distance between enough and not enough, between rent paid on time and rent paid 1 day late, between Bria having shoes to wear and Bria not having shoes to wear. Darcy had promised herself they'd last a few months. She had promised herself she'd replace them before they got too bad. She had promised herself a lot of things the monthly math of her life had quietly, patiently, without mercy, turned into impossible. But the one thing Darcy Campos never allowed, the one thing she poured whatever was left of her into after the bills and the hours and the exhaustion took their share, was letting Bria feel any of it. This was her biggest project, her most expensive construction, the thing she built every day with the last scraps of her energy. Bria would not grow up inside the heaviness of what they didn't have. Bria would feel loved, safe, and delighted by the world. So Darcy turned everything into an adventure. The bus ride to the mansion each morning on the days she had to bring Bria because the neighbor who sometimes watched her wasn't free became an expedition. The lunchbox Darcy packed, peanut butter with banana, a few slices of apple, a small handful of cookies, became a picnic. When Bria asked why the kids at the park had bigger toys, Darcy said everyone had different treasures, and the treasure the two of them had was each other. Bria accepted this with the deep ease of a child who is truly, completely, unconditionally loved. And Darcy went into the bathroom and cried about that too, because sometimes the most painful thing isn't the lack itself, it's watching your child trust you completely, while you know you're holding everything together with threads so thin you're afraid to look at them too closely. Darcy was cleaning the windows in the east wing, the squeegee moving in clean, precise arcs, when Preston appeared in the doorway. She knew something was up before he even spoke, because Preston never came looking for her mid-shift without a reason. And Preston was the kind of man whose reasons always came from one source. "Mr. Moretti wants to speak with you," Preston said. "When it's convenient. When it's convenient." Darcy knew that phrase wasn't an invitation. It was an order wrapped in politeness, the kind of language people around Rafe Moretti used to turn every command into something that sounded optional while, in truth, it absolutely wasn't. She felt the familiar tightening in her stomach, the kind of tightening the words, "Mr. Moretti wants to speak with you," would naturally create in anyone who depended on Mr. Moretti's continued goodwill for a paycheck. She set the squeegee down, wiped her hands on her apron, checked that her bun was still neat, that her uniform was free of stains, that everything about her exterior was telling the story she needed it to tell. Professional, reliable, nothing to worry about. Then she walked down the long hallway toward the main living area, chin level, breathing on purpose, and in her mind she ran back through the last week the way someone flips through pages on a checklist. Every task completed, every surface clean, every procedure followed. She hadn't done anything wrong. There was no reason this meeting had to be bad. She repeated that in her head like a quiet prayer, small and steady, the prayer of someone who knows that sometimes prayer is the only thing you can control when everything else is in someone else's hands. But even as she tried to calm herself, there was another part of her, the part that had lived for 11 months in this house, and had filed away enough fragments into a drawer she never opened. And that part reminded her that this was Rafe Moretti. And a meeting with Rafe Moretti could mean a great many things. It could be praise. It could be a correction. It could also be something she hadn't imagined yet. Something that lived in the shadowed territory she'd carefully avoided looking into for 11 months. Not all of it was safe. She passed the stretch of hallway where Bria had shuffled that morning, over the very marble floor where the torn pink shoes had made that tiny scuffing sound. And she didn't know that sound had already changed something inside the man she was about to meet. She stepped into the room. Rafe Moretti was standing by the window, And when he turned, the expression on his face was something she had never seen in 11 months of working in this house. Not the distant courtesy he used for most interactions. Not the cold, sharp focus she'd glimpsed when he was on the phone. Not anything dangerous, though she'd prepared herself for that possibility. It was something else. Something that looked like a man who'd just been reminded of something important and hadn't had time to rearrange his face into the right shape. "Miss Campos," he said. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." She sat. She clasped her hands in her lap so they wouldn't betray her. And she waited. "I want to start by saying this isn't a conversation about your work," Rafe said. And Darcy felt the knot in her stomach loosen a very small amount, just enough for her to keep breathing normally. "You're not in any trouble. Your position here isn't affected in any way. I want to be very clear about that before I say anything else." She nodded once. Her hands stayed clasped on her lap, pressing a little tighter. "I met Bria this morning." He paused, choosing his words with a care Darcy had never seen in him, a care unlike the kind used in negotiation or in giving orders. This was the care of someone trying not to break something fragile. "We talked for a little while. She showed me the rabbit." Something shifted in Darcy's face, her restrained professionalism giving way for a moment to something warmer, more instinctive, the particular softness that appears on any parent's face when their child is suddenly mentioned by someone who has no obligation to mention them at all. "She tends to wander," Darcy said. "I'm sorry if she bothered you." "She didn't bother me." Rafe's voice was steady but not hard. "She didn't bother me at all. She was perfect." Then he stopped, and Darcy saw something change in his eyes, like a man standing on a threshold, and knowing that once he stepped through, he wouldn't be able to step back. "I saw her shoes." The warmth left Darcy's face immediately. What replaced it was an expression she'd practiced for years, living in the narrow distance between self-respect and scarcity, a precise, conscious arrangement of dignity and exposure. The face of someone who has just realized the most private thing about her life has been seen. Her jaw didn't tighten. Her eyes didn't drop. She held herself with a calm that clearly cost something, and she said nothing, and she waited. "I'm not saying this to shame you," Rafe said. "I want to be absolutely clear about that. I'm saying it because I've been sitting with it for 3 hours, and I can't stop thinking about it, and I've decided I want to do something, and I need to ask you first." Darcy watched him carefully. "What do you want to do?" And this was the moment they would both remember later. Not the shoe shopping trip afterward. Not what happened in the weeks that followed. But this moment, when Rafe Moretti leaned forward, set his forearms on his knees, and looked at her. This was Rafe Moretti, the architect of the city's shadows. The man who gave orders that never had to be repeated. The man Darcy had spent 11 months carefully, not looking straight at. And he was sitting in front of her now, leaning forward like an ordinary person, with a face that was almost helpless. The face of someone caught mid-stride by his own emotion and fumbling. "I'm not sure what to do with it. I want to take Bria to buy shoes," he said. "I want to take you to buy shoes. And I want to know what else you need. Because I have more money than any reasonable person should ever have to use. And there's a child in my house walking around in torn shoes. And I don't know how to live with that if I don't do something." Darcy looked at him. In the 30 seconds between when he mentioned the shoes and now, she'd prepared for a dozen different versions of this conversation. She'd prepared for disdain, for kindness with an unspoken condition, for the kind of generosity that creates obligation, for the kind of giving with one hand while holding something over your head with the other. She'd even prepared, in the darkest corner of her practical mind, for the possibility that this conversation might somehow be about continuing to work here depending on not embarrassing the mansion. She hadn't prepared for this. For the way he leaned forward. For his forearms on his knees. For the expression on his face that she now recognized as almost helpless. The expression of the most powerful man she'd ever met sitting in front of her and trying, a little awkwardly, to find a way to handle his own feelings. "You don't have to do that," she said. Her voice was calm. She was proud of how calm it was. "I know. I want to. We're fine. I believe you," Rafe said. And what was striking was that it sounded like he truly believed it. Not dismissal, but recognition, an acknowledgement of her competence, her capability, the obvious truth that she was holding everything together. "I believe you're fine. This isn't about that. This is about the fact that I can help, and not helping feels wrong to me now. That's all." The silence stretched. "Okay." Darcy said. Rafe let out a slow breath, like a man who'd just realized he'd been holding it. One condition. Say it. You let her choose the shoes herself. She has her own opinions. Strong ones. She's 3. But she knows what she wants, and she should get to choose. Something opened on Rafe Moretti's face that no subordinate, no rival, no lawyer had ever noticed. Something with the quality of light spilling into a room that had been shut too long. Not quite a smile. More like the thing that happens right before a smile. The inside moment, before expression catches up. Strong opinions at 3, he said. I completely respect that. Before they went out to the car, Rafe called Wendell. Not to ask permission, because Rafe Moretti didn't ask permission from anyone, but out of a 13-year habit, Wendell was the only person he notified when the schedule changed, because Wendell was the one who had to know where he was at all times, because in their world, a boss dropping off the radar for even 2 hours could destabilize 3 territories. Where are you going? Wendell asked. To buy shoes. 4 seconds of silence. Darcy was standing close enough not to hear the words on the other end, but close enough to see Rafe in the hallway, with the phone to his ear, and the expression of a man enduring a reaction he'd expected. You. Buying shoes. For the kid. Darcy's daughter. 6 seconds of silence this time. 13 years I've known you, Wendell said. You've never canceled a meeting for anyone. Rafe didn't answer. All right, Wendell said. No joking. No judgment. A voice of acknowledgement. From someone who had just watched something shift in a place where 13 years of experience offered no precedent to reference, and who knew enough not to push, only to stand still and watch. The store Rafe chose was in Lincoln Park, taking up a corner of an outdoor shopping district, where the sidewalks had been pressure washed, and the flower planters were always fresh, and the shops had wide glass doors, and employees who greeted you right at the entrance. Darcy had walked past places like this her whole life. She had never stepped inside. She stepped into this one with Bria's hand in hers, Rafe a step behind them, wearing what she was realizing was his normal version. Dark jeans, a simple navy sweater, no jewelry besides the watch on his left wrist, and looking slightly awkward in a way that oddly made him more human, like someone operating outside his usual coordinates, and finding it both uncomfortable and maybe something else. A man in black had parked across from the store. Darcy saw him. Rafe saw her see him. No one said anything. This was the background layer she had learned to pretend not to notice, and today she kept pretending, because today wasn't the day to open that drawer. All right, Rafe said, squatting down to Bria's level with the mild clumsiness of someone who wasn't used to squatting or talking to children or both. We're here to buy shoes for you. The deal is you get to choose whichever pair you want. Bria looked at him with the serious, evaluating expression she reserved for important decisions. Any pair? Any pair. What if they're really expensive? Something moved across Rafe's face. A brief, complicated expression Darcy caught and set aside to think about later. Then we still buy them. Money isn't what we're considering here. Your feet are what we're considering. Bria studied him for another moment, running her own private internal review, then nodded and turned toward the wall of children's shoes, with the purposeful energy of someone who had just been given an important mission and intended to do it properly. The next 45 minutes were something Darcy would later describe to her mother, and she would know it would stay in her memory forever, not because of its scale, but because of its quality. The way time seemed to move differently inside that moment. Bria moved through the store with the absolute authority of a small human being in her own territory, pulling shoes down from display shelves, lifting them to inspect, asking to try the right size with a clarity that made the sales associate smile. She considered and rejected a pair of silver shoes. Pretty, but not me. She spent a full 4 minutes with a pair of rain boots decorated with cartoon foxes before deciding she needed them, even though it wasn't raining, and that need wasn't negotiable. She found a pair of light-up shoes, pink and silver, with small stars that blinked with every step, and she put them on and walked back and forth in front of the mirror with the focused satisfaction of someone who had discovered her own truth. Rafe sat on the bench and watched, his expression traveling far from the man who read encrypted messages every morning, settling into something quiet and full, the way water looks when it's very deep and very still. She's going to take all 4 pairs, isn't she? He murmured to Darcy, who stood beside the bench. She's going to try, Darcy said. She hesitated. You really don't have to. She can have all 4 pairs, Rafe said. Please. This makes me happy. I haven't said that about many things lately. He paused, watching Bria, who was now asking for a fifth option with embroidered kittens on the toes. I forgot what this feels like. Feels like what? Wanting to give someone something, he said, and not because of strategy. 4 pairs, Darcy said, but I'm stopping there. 4 pairs, he agreed, and Darcy realized he had also quietly chosen 2 pairs of shoes for her, set aside while she wasn't looking. And when she refused the first time, the second time, the third time, he said with a soft patience that was harder to argue with than any raised voice. You stand on your feet all day in my house. Please let me do this. Please. Rafe Moretti's please came from a real place. Darcy had discovered that, and it was very hard to refuse. When Bria stepped out of the store, she was wearing the light-up shoes, the pink and silver stars blinking with every confident step on the sidewalk, and both arms were wrapped around the bag, holding the other 3 pairs against her chest, with the expression of someone carrying treasure, which, in truth, she was. Darcy walked beside her, carrying the smaller bag with the 2 pairs of shoes she had refused 3 times, and accepted because Rafe Moretti's pleas came from a place she couldn't say no to. Bria stopped suddenly in the middle of the parking lot. She looked up at Rafe with a very serious face and lifted the bag. Thank you for my shoes. You're welcome, Rafe said. Mr. Patch says thank you too. Tell Mr. Patch he's very welcome. Bria considered this. Then she lifted both arms, the universal gesture of every 3-year-old in the world when they want to be picked up, aimed straight at Rafe Moretti, with the absolute certainty of a small person who had assessed the situation and concluded this was a perfectly reasonable request. For a moment, Rafe looked like a man who'd just been handed a physics problem he hadn't prepared for. Then he bent down and picked her up, a little awkwardly, shifting his grip until Bria settled against his shoulder and looped one small arm around his neck, with the natural ease of a child who had simply decided this was where she was going to be. The light-up shoes blinked pink stars in the Chicago afternoon. On the shoulder of the Mafia boss, the entire underworld feared. And in the car parked across from them, the man in black watched the scene, expressionless in the trained way of someone taught to be expressionless. But if you knew how to read it, and Darcy was beginning to learn how to read, something had shifted there too, in that face trained to show nothing. Rafe walked them to the bus stop. He offered to drive them home, but Darcy refused with a small shake of her head that he understood meant he shouldn't ask again, because there were boundaries she needed to keep, small distances she needed to maintain to remind herself she was still in control of her own life, that this afternoon was an exception and not a new rule. On the bus, Bria sat by the window, legs swinging on the seat, the light-up shoes blinking now and then when she lightly kicked at the air, her mouth telling Mr. Patch about every pair of shoes she'd tried on with the kind of detailed endurance only a 3-year-old can sustain without getting tired. The bag with the other 3 pairs sat on her lap, held with both hands, and Bria kept glancing down at it as if to confirm it was still there, still real. Darcy sat beside her daughter, her own shoe bag on the floor at her feet, and in the purse she carried there was something else, the old pink shoes. She had put them in the bag before leaving the mansion, not because she couldn't let go, but because there was dignity in not leaving behind something that had carried her daughter through 8 months. She looked down at the old shoes in her bag, the left sole still gaping, the right shoe still without a lace, the left toe still worn through, and she thought, not the kind of thinking that carries you away. Darcy Campos wasn't the kind of person who got carried away. She was the kind of person who processed, weighed, set each thing on the scale, and looked hard before deciding anything. She thought about the man whose black-clad subordinate parked across from a children's shoe store, the man with a gun in the kitchen drawer beside the linen napkins, the man Preston spoke about in code, the man whose basement meeting room radiated an unsettling stillness. That man had just squatted on the shoe store floor and asked her daughter which pair she liked. That man had just said, "Money isn't what we're considering here. Your feet are what we're considering." In a voice Darcy couldn't find a single grain of falsehood in. That man had just carried her daughter on his shoulder across a parking lot and looked like he'd received something instead of giving it. She thought about the distance between 2 worlds. Her world, buses and calculations and $4.99 shoes and a bathroom to cry in. His world, a $30 million mansion, and men in black, and a silent basement, and a kind of power she chose not to name. That distance was still there. It didn't disappear because of one afternoon of buying shoes, but it had narrowed, and Darcy realized, with the quiet discomfort of someone who always needed control, that she hadn't been the one to narrow it. It had narrowed on its own. by the blinking light-up shoes on her daughter's feet, by a 3-year-old arm around a Mafia boss's neck. By the way, Bria looked at Rafe Moretti without a shred of fear, and the way he looked back at her as if she were the most precious thing he'd been given in a long time. The bus shook lightly along Michigan Avenue. Bria had fallen asleep, her head against Darcy's shoulder, the light-up shoes completely dark in sleep. Darcy looked out the window, watched Chicago slide past in the afternoon light, and she knew the ground under her feet felt different than it had that morning. She told herself it was only because of the new shoes. The shoe shopping trip should have been the ending. The gesture had been made. The need had been met. The story had a natural stopping point, and the characters could have returned to their own corners of a world that had always kept them efficiently separated. But the wall didn't rebuild itself. The next Wednesday, Rafe came home from a meeting no one in the house asked about, because no one in the house asked about Rafe Moretti's meetings. But Preston opened the door faster than usual, and Rafe's jaw was tighter than usual, and something in the air around him as he crossed the threshold said that the afternoon, wherever he'd just been, hadn't been the kind of afternoon you came back from easily. He walked down the hallway toward the kitchen for water and stopped in the doorway. Bria was sitting in her high chair beside the counter, next to Mrs. Aldridge, and she was pressing the button on the mixer with a deeply satisfied, scientific expression, watching the batter spin with the concentration researchers reserve for an important chemical reaction. "I'm learning to cook," Bria announced without looking up. "Muffins for Mama." "I see that," Rafe said. "What kind of muffins?" "The kind with blueberries." "Do you like blueberry muffins?" Bria asked. And that question, so simple it was almost meaningless, did something inside Rafe's chest he hadn't anticipated. Because the answer was yes, and he knew it was yes, not because he thought about it, but because the smell of batter and blueberries and butter melting in the oven carried something from very far away, from a smaller kitchen, from before money, before power, before the compound interest of ambition sped his life past the point where you still noticed what you liked. His grandmother. She used to make blueberry muffins on Sunday mornings when he was a boy, in a kitchen with a small window and yellow light, and she was the last woman before Bria who had looked at him without fear. "They're my favorite," Rafe said. He poured water, sat down at the counter, and without making any decision about it, he stayed. His jaw softened. Whatever he'd brought home from the afternoon meeting began to dissolve in the kitchen air that smelled like baking muffins. "You get to have one," Bria said, with the generosity of someone distributing from a supply that was limited and precious. "But Mama gets the most." "That's only fair," Rafe agreed. "Mrs. Aldridge caught his eye across the kitchen and smiled. A small, warm smile from someone who had cooked in this house long enough to know what it was missing, and had just watched that missing thing appear beside the mixing bowl on a high chair. Darcy came to pick Bria up when her shift ended. She stood in the kitchen doorway and saw the scene. Rafe sitting at the counter with what was clearly his second muffin, Bria in the high chair beside him, explaining with great seriousness and limited scientific accuracy the life cycle of a blueberry in the way she understood it. And the expression that crossed Darcy's face in that moment was something she caught and erased very quickly. But not quickly enough, because Rafe saw it. He saw it because now he was paying attention. They began to talk on evenings when Darcy was finishing up her shift and Bria was tired, curled in the corner of a sofa somewhere with Mr. Patch, and the house held the softer silence of late night. They talked the way people talk who never intended to start talking, and discover too late to do anything reasonable about it that they don't want to stop. Rafe told her about his father, shot in a territorial dispute when Rafe was 24, and his mother, who died 4 months later, as if she couldn't exist on her own without him. Rafe had built everything in the years after with the total, absolute investment of a man who had converted grief into fuel and didn't know how to convert it back. With sleepless nights, with decisions ordinary people never had to make, with pieces of his humanity he cut away one by one to survive. He didn't share details. He didn't have to. Darcy understood enough from the spaces between his sentences. Darcy asked about the expansive oak table, why he kept it. Rafe paused, and his face held the expression of a man who had just been asked a question no one had asked in 13 years, a question he himself had never asked. "I don't know," he said. "It's a table for a family," Darcy said. 12 people are supposed to sit at that table. It's waiting." The silence stretched. "I think I forgot how to want that," Rafe said. "I don't think you forgot," Darcy said. "I think you're afraid." He looked at her for a long time. "You're very direct." My mother tells the truth because she doesn't have time or energy for anything else, Darcy said. It gets into you. And Rafe looked at her in the late kitchen light that still smelled faintly of blueberry muffins, and realized that this was the most dangerous thing he'd faced in 13 years. Not a rival, not betrayal, but a woman who spoke straight into the places he had sealed shut, and wasn't afraid of how he might react. In the stretch of time after those evenings of talking, Rafe asked Preston to quietly look into Louisa Campos's medical debt. He said it with the calm of a man giving an everyday instruction. No emphasis, no explanation, and Preston, who had worked for Rafe for 9 years and had developed an almost absolute ability to read the true meaning behind each order his employer gave, asked no clarifying questions and offered no commentary. He only said, "Yes, sir," and handled it. 3 days later, Preston came back with a number. Rafe looked at the number. It was negligible. In the math of Rafe's life, where sums far larger moved through the port every night, where a single phone call could shift amounts most people never saw in their entire lives, Louisa Campos's medical debt was so small it almost didn't exist. But this time, it didn't feel like a transaction. Every night when money moved through his system, it was pure number, abstract, detached from any face. This time the number had a face. It had Darcy's face sitting on the front steps, talking about that Tuesday in November. It had Bria's face walking in torn shoes across marble. It had the face of a woman named Louisa he hadn't met, but had heard enough about to know she was the kind of person who stretched $1 until it cried for mercy and said, "We'll do the math," when everything collapsed. "Handle it," Rafe said. Preston handled it. Darcy found out on a Tuesday morning when her mother called. Louisa was crying so hard she could barely form a sentence, only fragments breaking apart between sobs. The collections company called. Paid off. All of it. Anonymous source. Darcy sat in her car in the parking lot of the Gold Coast mansion and listened to her mother cry through the phone and felt something huge and overwhelming move through her. Gratitude and grief and relief, all compressed together into something that had nowhere to go but out. She pressed her forehead to the steering wheel and cried. Morning sunlight came through the windshield, and Bria slept in the back seat, her light-up shoes completely dark in sleep, and Darcy cried until the overwhelm drained out of her, and there was only the tired stillness of someone who has just set down a burden she'd carried so long. Her body had forgotten what it felt like not to have it. She knew immediately there was only one anonymous source. When she went inside and met Rafe in the hallway, he was on his way to his office. He stopped, looked at her face, and understood at once that she knew, and the expression he would have prepared, the neutral, deflecting mask he would have used in any other situation to avoid emotion, didn't have time to rise to the surface, because she looked at him with eyes as clear and direct as the first day in the living room, the day of the shoes, and she said, "Thank you." He nodded. "That's the most important thing anyone has ever done for me," she said. "I want you to know that." He looked down at his shoes. Then he looked back at her. "Your mother should be able to get well without that weight on your shoulders," he said. "That's all. It's not complicated." "For me it is," Darcy said. "I want you to know that." They stood in the hallway of the $30 million house and looked at each other in the way of two people realizing, with equal parts astonishment and unease, that the distance between their worlds had become something you could cross. Wendell found out the next day, because Preston reported it. Because in Rafe Moretti's system, money didn't move without an internal trail, and Wendell was the one who read every trail. He came to Rafe that evening, in the office, the door closed, and he spoke plainly in the way only Wendell was allowed to speak plainly to Rafe Moretti. "You know," Wendell said, "if anyone finds out you care about that mother and kid, they become a target. Not a threat, not an objection, a fact, delivered in the flat voice of a man who had lived in this world long enough to know that affection was the most dangerous luxury a boss could possess. Because affection created weakness, and weakness created leverage, and leverage in an enemy's hands created disaster." Rafe stayed silent. Wendell stayed silent. The room was quiet in the way only this room could be quiet. The kind of quiet shared by two men who had spent 13 years together in a world where silence was sometimes the most honest conversation you could have. Both of them understood. Rafe understood Wendell was right. Wendell understood Rafe wasn't going to stop. And both of them understood that from this moment on, the calculation had changed. Not because the risk had gotten smaller, but because the thing on the other side of the scale, the thing that smelled like blueberry muffins and sounded like blinking shoes on the kitchen floor, and a small, round voice asking, "Do you like blueberry muffins?" had become heavier than the risk. It happened late one night, 2 weeks after the debt was paid. Darcy was cleaning Rafe's office. He wasn't home. Preston told her to clean it as usual, and she was wiping down the desk, straightening a stack of papers she never read because reading Rafe Moretti's documents wasn't on the list of things she allowed herself to do, when she realized the television in the room was still on, forgotten, the volume low. The local news, a segment about rising violence on the South Side, about a shooting at a warehouse near the port, about what the reporter called an expanding control network, and on the screen, distant, blurry footage, police tape, an ambulance, and at the edge of the frame, almost cut off but not quite, a black car Darcy recognized. Not because she remembered the license plate, because she had seen it parked across from the shoe store in Lincoln Park the afternoon her daughter tried on blinking light-up shoes. She set the cleaning cloth down. She watched the screen for another 10 seconds. Then she turned the television off and stood in Rafe Moretti's office, alone, in silence. And the drawer in her mind, the drawer she had kept carefully shut for 11 months, sprang open. Not because of the car, not because of the news, but because she realized, standing in this room with the leather smell from the chair and the oak smell from the desk, and the thick silence the room always carried, that she had known. She had known for a long time, maybe since the first week, when she noticed the way Preston lowered his voice when he took phone calls near her, or the oppressive quiet emanating from the meeting room downstairs, or the way the two men at the gate never smiled. She had known the way you know winter is coming before the snow falls, known in her bones and not in words, known and chosen not to know, filed it into a drawer and kept it closed, because opening it would force her to do something, and doing something could mean losing this job, and losing this job could mean the calculation collapsed. But now the calculation was different. Now her daughter asked, "When do I get to see Uncle Rafe again?" Every night before bed. Now her daughter dreamed of light-up shoes and blueberry muffins, and the man who squatted on the shoe store floor and asked which pair she liked. Now that drawer wouldn't stay shut, because what was inside it was no longer abstract fragments about a stranger. It had become a specific, sharp question that cut straight into the mother in her. The man her daughter had attached herself to was the same man whose car she had just seen on an 11 o'clock news story about violence. She went home that night by bus, Bria asleep against her shoulder because today was one of the days she had to bring her along, and the apartment in Pilsen greeted her with the familiar smell of the small kitchen, and the distant sound of the train, and the fluorescent kitchen light she always forgot to replace, flickering faintly in the left corner. She bathed Bria. She put her into pajamas. She read a story, the one Bria asked to hear over and over 3 times, before she would agree to close her eyes, the one about a bear looking for a friend, and Darcy read in an even, warm voice while inside her everything was spinning. She waited until Bria's breathing slowed into the steady, deep rhythm of a child who was completely safe in sleep. Then she slid her hand out of her daughter's hand as gently as she could and went into the kitchen. She sat at the kitchen table, under the flickering fluorescent light, alone, and she thought. She thought about the man who paid her mother's debt without needing anyone to know, the man who said, "Your mother should get well without that weight," in a voice that didn't make it complicated. The man who carried her daughter on his shoulder across a parking lot and looked like he had received something instead of giving. The man who sat in the kitchen eating his second muffin and whose jaw softened as he listened to a 3-year-old lecture about the life cycle of blueberries. The man who bought shoes for her child. The man who paid the debt for her mother. The man who said, "It's waiting," when she asked about the 12-seat table, in the voice of someone who had just realized something he had never allowed himself to think about. And that man was also a man who... Darcy stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She knew the rest. She had always known. The difference was that now the rest was no longer sitting in a closed drawer. It was sitting across from her at the kitchen table in Pilsen, under the flickering fluorescent light, and it wasn't going anywhere, and she was going to have to look straight at it and decide. That night Darcy couldn't sleep. She lay on the bed in the Pilsen apartment, eyes open on the ceiling where the streetlight outside painted long bands of light through the gap in the curtains, and she heard every sound of the night more clearly than ever. The distant rumble of the train, someone shutting a car door downstairs, the soft rush of pipes inside the walls, and the steady breathing of Bria on the little bed, less than a single step away. Bria shifted at 2 o'clock in the morning, not waking, only the kind of shifting a child does in the middle of a dream, vivid enough for the body to react. And inside that dream, Bria murmured, her voice small and round and blurred in the half-awake space. "Uncle Rafe says he likes light-up shoes." Then she curled in again, hugged Mr. Patch tighter, and sank back into deep sleep with the absolute ease of a 3-year-old who didn't know the world was far more complicated than blinking shoes and blueberry muffins and a kind man squatting on a store floor. Darcy lay in the dark and listened to her daughter dream about the man who held Chicago's pulse in his hand, and the question she had avoided since sitting at the kitchen table under the fluorescent light wouldn't let her avoid it anymore. It lay there on the ceiling, shining down on her with the streetlight, clear and cold. Do I have the right? Do I have the right to let my daughter attach herself to a man who lives in a world that could swallow both of them whole? Darcy wasn't the kind of person who romanticized danger. She grew up in Pilsen, where she'd seen enough to know violence wasn't romantic, that underworld power wasn't a movie, that the people standing closest to the eye of the storm were usually the ones hurt worst when the storm hit. She thought about quitting, finding another job, cutting it clean, fast, decisive, before Bria attached more deeply, before the name Uncle Rafe became something you couldn't pull out of her daughter's world without leaving a tear behind. But she also knew, lying in the dark and listening to her child breathe, that before might already be too late. Bria was attached. The arm around his neck in the parking lot was proof. The dream she'd just spoken was proof. Cutting it now would cut into Bria. Across the city, in the Gold Coast mansion, Rafe Moretti couldn't sleep either. He sat in his office, in the leather chair he'd sat in for thousands of nights before, at the desk where he'd made thousands of decisions. But tonight the room felt different, as if its dimensions had changed, the walls drawn closer, the ceiling lowered. Not in fact, but in the way space contracts when you sit alone inside it too long and start to realize you've been alone inside it too long. Wendell's call still echoed in his mind. Not the words, Wendell had only said one sentence, but the silence after it, the silence of two men who shared an understanding no one needed to explain further. In their world, affection was a weapon, not a weapon you used, but a weapon other people used against you. If any of the men opposing him, the men who wanted his territory, wanted his power, wanted him dead, found out that Rafe Moretti cared about a woman who cleaned his house and her 3-year-old child, then Darcy and Bria wouldn't be people anymore. They would be leverage. And leverage in this world didn't end well. He thought about the warning, a target. Then he thought about Bria's eyes when she lifted her arms to be picked up in the parking lot. Big, round brown eyes without a single grain of fear. Eyes that looked at him as if he were safety and not danger. He thought about the small hand around his neck, weighing less than a single pound and heavier than anything he had ever carried. He thought about Darcy saying, "I think you're afraid," in the late kitchen light that smelled like muffins. And with the same question Darcy was facing in Pilsen, Rafe faced it in Gold Coast, only from the other side. Do I have the right? Do I have the right to pull them into the orbit of my life when that orbit contains bullets and enemies, and the kind of silence a basement meeting room holds? Do I have the right to want something I've spent 13 years convincing myself I didn't need, when the cost of wanting it might not be paid by me, but by them? 2 people, 2 rooms, 2 sides of the same city. Darcy lying in the dark listening to her child breathe in Pilsen. Rafe sitting alone under a desk lamp in the Gold Coast. The same question, the same night, and no answer arriving before morning. The next morning, Darcy arrived at the mansion 15 minutes earlier than usual. She settled Bria in the kitchen with Mrs. Aldridge, checked that Mr. Patch was in her daughter's hands, and that her daughter was steady with a bowl of cereal. Then she went straight to Rafe's office. She didn't wait for Preston. She didn't wait to be summoned. She didn't wait for schedules or permission, or any of the procedures in the system she had followed perfectly for 11 months. She knocked. 2 knocks, short and clear. The kind of knock that belongs to someone who has already decided, before her fist touches wood, that she will step in no matter what the answer is. "Come in," Rafe's voice said from inside. She opened the door and walked in. Rafe sat behind his desk, phone in his hand. And when he looked up and saw her, there was a moment of real surprise on his face. Brief, but impossible to hide, because in 11 months, Darcy Campos had never come to his office on her own. Not once. She was the one who got called, not the one who called. She was the one who waited for orders, not the one who set the meeting. And now she was standing in his doorway at 7:45 in the morning, with an expression he recognized from their kitchen conversations, the expression Darcy wore when she was about to say something true, an expression calm and direct and certain and costing her a great deal. "I know who you are," Darcy said. No introduction. No circling. No softening. 5 words, laid in the room like placing a heavy object on a table. And on Rafe Moretti's face, faster than any expression Darcy had ever seen in him, something closed. Not anger. Not fear. A reflex. The automatic closing of a door in a man who had lived for 13 years in a world where anyone who knew who he was could be a threat. The wall went up instantly. His face went flat and unreadable and distant. The face of a boss, not the face of the man who ate muffins in the kitchen. Darcy saw the wall rise on his face, and she didn't step back. She had expected this. She had spent the whole night preparing for exactly this moment. For the possibility that the instant she spoke plainly, the man in front of her would become the version the whole city feared, instead of the version her daughter called uncle. And she had decided she would speak, no matter which version he became, because her mother taught her to tell the truth, and it had soaked into her, and last night was the last night she would allow herself to lie in the dark, with an unspoken question. I know who you are, she repeated, slower, not because she thought he hadn't heard, but because she wanted him to understand she wasn't speaking in heat or panic. She was speaking after a sleepless night of weighing, that every word had been chosen. And my daughter asks when she'll see Uncle Rafe again every night before she falls asleep. Something shifted behind the wall on Rafe's face when she said Bria's name. Small, but she saw it. She saw it because she had learned how to read him during those evenings in the kitchen. And the wall he built was good. But it wasn't as good as it had been 13 years ago, because there was a crack where Bria had gotten through. And you couldn't rebuild that crack completely, when the thing that made it was a 3-year-old clutching a one-eyed stuffed rabbit. So I need you to look at me, Darcy said, and tell me the truth. Is she safe? Silence. The heaviest silence this house had ever held. And this house had held many kinds of heavy silence over 13 years. The silence of the basement, the silence of Preston's phone calls, the silence of nights. Rafe sat alone after making decisions he never told anyone about. But no silence was heavier than this one, because this silence held the answer to a question that, if he answered wrong, would cost him the only thing in 13 years that had made him want to stop and stay. Yes, Rafe said. His voice wasn't flat anymore. The wall was still there, but it had cracked further, and through the crack Darcy could see the man behind it, the man who had carried her daughter on his shoulder in a parking lot and looked like he'd been handed something precious. On my life. Darcy looked at him. She read his eyes the way she read everyone's eyes. The way you learn when you grow up in Pilsen, where reading people correctly is a survival skill, where you learn to tell the difference between a man who says "on my life" like a line, and a man who says "on my life" and truly means he would die before letting anything touch the person he's protecting. Rafe Moretti was the second kind. She was sure. I'm staying, Darcy said. And before anything could change on Rafe's face, before the crack could widen into relief, she continued, but you never bring that world into this house when my daughter is here. Never. Never, Rafe said. No hesitation, no condition, no negotiation. 2 words, firm and final in the way he gave every order that never needed to be repeated. But this time it wasn't an order. It was a promise. And Darcy could hear the difference. Darcy Campos, 27, a single mother, the woman who cleaned the mansion, the woman whose mother taught her to tell the truth because she didn't have strength for anything else, had just set a boundary for Chicago's Mafia boss. And Chicago's Mafia boss nodded. 2 weeks after the confrontation in the office, after 2 weeks in which everything between them had shifted into a new zone, a zone where boundaries had been set and a promise had been given, and both of them were carefully walking on new ground no one had a map for. Rafe called Darcy one evening when Bria was asleep in the corner of the sofa with Mr. Patch, and the house held the soft quiet of late hours. He stood by the living room window, looking out into the garden in the dark, and when she arrived, he didn't turn right away. He kept looking out for a few more seconds, and Darcy realized he was preparing. Not the kind of preparing a man does before giving an order, but the kind of preparing a man does before saying something that costs him, something he had sat with alone long enough to know it would hurt, and still had to be said. I think I should be direct, Rafe said, turning to look at her, because you taught me that directness is the only thing worth saying. Darcy stayed still and waited. I don't know if I have the right to pull you into my world, he said. You and Bria. Wendell is right. If anyone finds out, you become the thing my enemies use to reach me. And I've lived long enough in this world to know they won't hesitate. He paused. Pulling you in is selfish. I know that. And I need you to know that I know. Darcy looked at him, the man standing in front of her voluntarily offering her reasons to leave, the man who had spent 13 years building walls and was now trying to build another, not to keep her out but to protect her with distance. And she understood this was the most dangerous version of care she had ever met, the self-destroying kind, the kind of love that cuts itself away because it believes its own absence is the best gift it can give. Are you afraid for you? Darcy said, cutting in. Or are you afraid for me? Rafe stopped. Because if you're afraid for me, she said, her voice calm and clear in the way her mother would recognize immediately as the Campos family voice when they spoke the most important things, then let me decide. I'm an adult. My eyes are open. I know what I'm stepping into. You don't get to decide for me in order to protect me. Silence. I trust my child's eyes more than anything, she said, and my child looks at you with the eyes she only uses for someone she trusts. Rafe stood by the window and looked at the 27-year-old woman who had taken the reason he'd offered to retreat and placed it back in front of him and said, No, you don't get to retreat because of me. If you want to retreat, then retreat because of you. But don't use me as your reason. And he realized this was the second time she had set a boundary for him. The first was, don't bring the darkness home when my child is here. And this time it was, you don't get to cut me out of decisions about my own life. And both times he had no argument, because both times she was right. All right, he said. I want to try, if you agree. I agree, Darcy said. He met Louisa one Sunday afternoon 3 weeks later, in the Pilsen apartment that smelled like cinnamon and lavender hand cream. Louisa Campos sat at the kitchen table, the woman who could stretch $1 until it cried for mercy, who had survived stage 3 cancer, who had looked at her daughter and said, We'll do the math, when everything collapsed. And she evaluated Rafe Moretti with the calm, clear eyes of someone who had lived through enough in this world not to trust anyone until they proved themselves. She saw the long scar across the back of his right hand. She saw the way he sat, never turning his back to the door, the habit of a man who lived in a world where turning your back to the door could be the last thing you ever did. She saw the black car parked outside and the man in black sitting inside, expressionless. She didn't ask. She had lived long enough to know there were questions whose answers sat right in front of you, if you knew how to look. And Louisa Campos knew how to look. She spoke in Portuguese, slow and clear, looking straight into Rafe's eyes. You look like a man who's been lonely for so long he doesn't even know it. Rafe was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. Maybe that's true. Louisa nodded back. She turned to the plate of muffins on the table. Blueberry ones. The kind Darcy had brought the recipe home from Mrs. Aldridge and baked this morning. And she took one with the calm of someone who had delivered an assessment and would hold that assessment until new evidence arrived. Temporary acceptance, but her eyes, when she looked at Rafe over the top of the muffin, said something else. They said, I'm watching, and I won't stop watching, and if you hurt my daughter, no wall you build will ever be high enough. There was a moment, 2 months later, that Rafe would return to again and again in his mind. Late afternoon, the last sunlight poured into the back garden of the mansion at a low, golden angle. The kind of light you only get for about 40 minutes before dark. The kind of light he hadn't even noticed was beautiful for 13 years. Because for 13 years he was always in a meeting room, or a basement, or on the phone at this hour. Bria was out in the garden, conducting a survey of the flower beds with the serious scientific focus she brought to every investigation. Head down, hands parting leaves, eyes tracking the ground with the expression of a field researcher following an important discovery. Darcy sat on the steps leading out to the yard. She'd taken off her shoes and set them neatly beside her, bare feet on warm stone, her face tilted up into the last sun, eyes closed, and on her face there was something Rafe hadn't seen before, or more truthfully, hadn't seen in a form this whole, a letting go. Not complete letting go, because Darcy Campos wasn't the kind of person who completely let go. But the closest version of letting go she allowed herself, the rare moment when she wasn't calculating, wasn't managing, wasn't carrying, she was only sitting and catching the sun. Rafe stood beside her, and without planning, without deciding, without calculating strategy, he bent down and took her hand. That was all. A hand with a long scar across the back, a hand that had signed orders and held a gun and done things she chose not to ask about. Taking a hand roughened by daily scrubbing, a hand that had wiped down thousands of surfaces in his house, a hand that braided Bria's hair every morning and wrung out towels and held everything together with threads so thin she herself was afraid to look too closely. Darcy opened her eyes. She looked at their joined hands, his scar pressed against the roughness of her skin, 2 maps of 2 different lives touching. Then she looked up at him, and then she rested her head against his leg, light, natural, the simplest and most honest gesture, the gesture of someone who had run through every calculation, every risk, every reason not to do this, and decided this was safe, real, and worth it. They stayed like that until Bria ran over from the flower bed, both hands cupped around something, her face bright with the excitement of someone who had just made a scientific breakthrough. "I found a worm," she announced, holding out her hands to show them an earthworm twisting between muddy little fingers. "It needs a home. Can it stay here?" "It lives in the dirt, sweetheart," Darcy said. "It already has a home." Bria looked at the worm, not entirely convinced, clearly holding different opinions about the quality of the worm's housing and weighing options for improvement. Rafe watched her, and Darcy felt his hand tighten slightly around hers. Rafe began to sleep better after that moment. Not immediately, not completely, because 13 years of insomnia didn't vanish because of one afternoon in a garden, but gradually, in the way water finds its way through cracks in stone, something inside him began to loosen. He started going to meetings with what his assistant privately described as different energy. Still sharp, still focused, but no longer running on the tightly compressed, almost frantic fuel of a man with nothing but work to balance against work. He started coming home on time on Sundays. He started noticing the quality of morning light, the way it fell through the kitchen windows at different angles depending on the season, and he realized that for 13 years he had missed it every morning because he was always looking at a screen instead of looking at the window. And one Tuesday morning in January, Rafe stood in the kitchen drinking coffee, and he saw the drawing. Bria had taped it to the refrigerator with a flower-shaped magnet, drawn in crayon with the unmistakable artistic style of a 3-year-old. 4 people standing side by side with highly interpretive height proportions and limited technical accuracy. Under each figure, Darcy's handwriting labeled it in the order Bria had dictated. Mama, Rafe, Bria, Mr. Patch. Mr. Patch was the same size as Rafe. All 4 figures had the same enormous smiling mouth. Rafe stood in the kitchen looking at the drawing and felt something move through him, wide and quiet and settling, the way water finds its level after a long disturbance. 4 stick figures with huge smiles, a stuffed rabbit as big as a Mafia boss. And he looked at that drawing and thought about a morning months ago, when he had looked up from his tablet and seen torn pink shoes on the marble floor. And he understood that everything had started there, with the small hole in the left toe where he could see the tip of a thin pink sock. And now he was standing in the kitchen, looking at a drawing of 4 people on the refrigerator, and drinking coffee in a morning light, so beautiful he actually noticed. 6 months later, the 12-seat dining table had been moved. Not far, still in the same house, still the same dark oak table that had carried the weight of Moretti family meals through 2 generations, but it had been moved from the main dining room, the formal room with the high ceiling and the chandelier and the expensive silence, into the open kitchen area the interior designer had once called the breakfast nook, which in practice had become the true center of the house, the room where morning light poured in strongest, where it always smelled like coffee and something baking, where you could hear the kitchen and the garden through the glass doors that opened onto the yard. The idea to move the table was Bria's. Technically, she announced one morning with the absolute authority she brought to every household arrangement that the big table was too far from the kitchen. It took too long to go get food, and being in there was really boring. She said the last part with the precision of a 3-year-old. Really boring. And those 2 words landed with a sharpness no adult in the room could dodge, because every one of them heard it and knew a child had just named the thing they all felt, but no one had said out loud. The table was moved that weekend. The table still had 12 seats. On Sunday morning, it was full. Louisa Campos came every Sunday, 3 months into remission and a little stronger each week, bringing the smell of lavender hand cream and the ability to turn any refrigerator into a feast, and a particular look she gave her daughter that said, "I'm here, I'm proud, and I'm not finished." She came with her niece Nina, 25, funny in the dry, fast way of someone who grew up turning hardship into jokes, and Nina's boyfriend, Jude, quiet, but he washed dishes without being asked, and for that alone he was accepted immediately. Preston came because he was invited, and it turned out Preston, who had eaten lunch alone at his desk for 9 years, when placed at a table with 11 other people, was a surprisingly warm human being, with a startlingly deep expertise in board games no one knew he played. Mrs. Aldridge came and brought food and refilled everyone's plate without asking, because that was her love language, and everyone received it as love language. Wendell came, reluctant the first time, less reluctant the second, the third time as if he had always belonged here. He brought his wife, Margot, and Margot talked with Louisa for 3 straight hours the first time they met, then left with Louisa's phone number and a blueberry muffin recipe and a promise to come back next Sunday. Bria sat at the head of the table. No one voted. No one arranged it. It happened naturally, the way the truest things happen. One Sunday she climbed into the chair at the head, the chair that had always been empty before, and announced she could see everyone from here and she was going to sit here. And that was that. She wore her light-up shoes every Sunday, pink stars blinking across the kitchen floor, as she moved from person to person on the orbit of someone making sure everyone at her table had what they needed. She learned that from her mother. Everyone at the table could see it. Rafe sat to Bria's right. No one arranged that either. It was entirely his choice. He sat there with the particular quality of a man who had learned, over 6 months of Sundays, what it felt like to have somewhere to go that he hadn't engineered, a place that asked nothing of him except his presence, and truly wanted that presence. He sat there drinking coffee and listening to 12 people fill the table that had been built for exactly that purpose. And he looked across the table to where Darcy was laughing at something Nina had just said, her head tipped back, her whole face open and unguarded in the way only Sunday morning could bring out in her. And he felt something there was no equivalent word for in the world he used to operate in. Home. Wendell sat across from him, and Darcy caught the moment Wendell watched Rafe laugh. Really laugh. Not the polite laugh or the cold laugh, but the kind of laugh that used the whole face, and Wendell turned to Margot and murmured, 13 years. I've never seen him like this. Margot took her husband's hand under the table, and for the first time, when the phone vibrated in his pocket, a message from the other world, from territories and the port and encrypted calls and basement silence. Rafe didn't look. He let it vibrate. He chose the table. The torn pink shoes were sealed inside a small wooden frame, set on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light touched them first every day. Bleached and dulled, the left sole still gaping, the right shoe still without a lace, the left toe still worn through, the same hole through which, months earlier, Rafe Moretti had seen the tip of a thin pink sock and felt something pass through every wall he had ever built. They sat there behind glass like a keepsake, like a reminder, like proof that small, broken things could change the direction of everything. Bria asked about them one morning while she was sitting on the kitchen counter eating cereal, feet swinging, her light-up shoes blinking softly whenever her heels tapped the cabinet below. "Why is that there?" she asked, pointing at the framed glass on the windowsill. Darcy was pouring coffee, and she paused, looked at the shoes in the frame, and answered in the voice she used when she told Bria important things, calm and clear and warm. "So we remember something important." "What?" "That sometimes," Darcy said, "the thing that looks broken is the thing that opens the door." Bria studied the shoes in the frame with the seriousness she brought to any new information that needed to be processed. Then her face lit up in the way children light up when they find a connection between two things adults assume they can't connect. "Like Mr. Patch's eye," she said. "He lost one eye, but he can still see where he's going." "Exactly like that," Darcy said, and she smiled. The kind of smile that only appears when her daughter says something so true there's nothing left to add. There was something else Darcy discovered. Not the same day, but on another morning. An ordinary morning, when she opened the kitchen drawer to get napkins. That drawer, the drawer she had known since her first months working in this house, held something beside the linen. The drawer she had opened hundreds of times, and each time had seen cold steel lying next to white cloth, and each time had closed it again without reacting, because reacting was a luxury. That drawer now held only napkins. Darcy stood in the kitchen, hand holding the drawer open, and stared at the empty space where the gun had once been. No one told her. No one announced it. Rafe didn't declare it or explain it or turn it into a grand gesture. He had simply moved it, quietly. Sometimes she didn't know, the way he had paid her mother's debt, without noise, without needing anyone to see. She stood there in the kitchen for a long time, looking at that absence, where cold steel used to be, and now there was only white linen and morning light. And she understood. This was how Rafe Moretti said things he didn't know how to say out loud. The framed shoes on the windowsill said, This is where everything began. The empty drawer said, "I choose this." On the last Sunday of the year, a Sunday in December, when the sunlight came through the kitchen windows at its lowest and most golden angle, the 12-seat table was full, and blueberry muffins had just come out of the oven, and Bria was making her Sunday rounds to confirm that everyone at her table was happy. Louisa was telling Nina something in Portuguese that made Nina cover her mouth and lean over laughing. Jude sat beside Nina, quiet and smiling, his hands automatically stacking the dirty plates into a neat pile, because washing dishes was his love language. Preston and Wendell were having a small but fierce argument about something involving both history and board games, an argument they were both clearly enjoying more than any other conversation they'd had all week. Mrs. Aldridge moved around the table, refilling coffee and orange juice without anyone needing to ask. Margot was leaning toward Louisa to listen to the story, her hand still holding Wendell's under the table from some unknown moment earlier. Bria came to Rafe's chair and tugged his sleeve. "What is it, sweetheart?" he said. "I made you this," she said, and from behind her back she pulled out a drawing, the crayon still a little sticky and fresh, and held it up for him to see. 4 people. Larger than the one on the refrigerator, because in 6 months she had improved, and the 4 of them stood in front of something that was clearly a house. All of them had the same kind of enormous smiling mouth, but this time, at the bottom, in Darcy's careful handwriting as she wrote what Bria dictated, there was a title, "Our Family." Rafe looked at the drawing. He looked for a long time, and his throat did something it hadn't done in 13 years. Not since before a 3-year-old clutching a one-eyed stuffed rabbit wandered into his dining room on an ordinary morning and changed the direction of everything. He held the drawing with both hands, carefully, like he was holding something so precious he didn't dare grip it too hard. "Perfect," he said. "I know," Bria said, with the satisfaction of someone who had predicted the reaction correctly. "Can I have a muffin? You can have 2. Mama says 1. "Mama is smarter than I am," he said. 1. Bria nodded, satisfied that everything had been properly settled, and turned back toward the plate of muffins with the purposeful energy of someone whose work here was complete, her light-up shoes blinking pink stars across the kitchen floor. Rafe looked up from the drawing and met Darcy's eyes across the table. She was watching him with the expression he'd learned how to read over 6 months of Sundays. Warm and clear and slightly astonished, the face of a woman who had been practical and careful and self-reliant for so long that when someone truly, completely saw her, it was still a surprise every time, still moved through her like something new. He lifted the drawing toward her across the table. She looked. He watched her face, and Darcy Campos, 27, Bria's mother, Louisa's daughter, the woman who stretched every dollar and carried every burden and spoke every truth, smiled. The kind of smile that comes from the deepest part of a person, the part that lives beneath all the layers of management and practicality, and the beautiful armor that had been necessary. The table was full. The framed shoes on the windowsill caught December sun. The kitchen drawer held only linen napkins. 12 people around the table laughed and talked and passed muffins and were imperfect and miraculous and complete. A family. There are things that begin with a very small hole in a very small pair of shoes, and end in something that finally feels enough. Today's story reminds us that sometimes the miracle doesn't come from a far-off place. It comes from the moment we stop long enough to truly see the person beside us, to see the torn shoes and the shelved dreams, and the quiet courage of people carrying everything alone without ever complaining. That love doesn't have to be perfect to be whole. That family doesn't have to be blood. It can be the people who choose to sit at the same table with you every Sunday morning, and that the thing that looks broken, whether it's a pair of shoes or a one-eyed stuffed rabbit or a heart that has been closed too long, is sometimes the very thing that opens the most beautiful door. If this story touched some corner of you, please tap like and share the video so more people can hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. We'd really love to know how you felt about this story, who it reminded you of in real life, or what it touched in what you're going through. So please leave a comment below so we can listen to the feelings from deep in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video very good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.